Good morning, we'll make a start. My name's Michael Crawford, I'm CEO of the Soil CRC. Welcome to today's webinar to be delivered by Mark Morrison. I'll come back to Mark in a minute, but whilst we're waiting for people to log on and the number of attendees is still rapidly increasing, let me just say a few words about the Soil CRC. We've got 130 people registered for today's webinar, and looking at the names, there's many that are familiar. There's also many that are visitors from different parts. So welcome to the Soil CRC webinar series. Just a few words about the Soil CRC. Essentially, we're funded by the Australian government and our 40 participants, both cash and in kind. We have support for 10 years. We've just ticked over into the 4th year of the CRC, been going for 3 years. We've got another 7 years to go. It brings together 8 universities, 4 state government agencies, a number of other industry partners, and 20 farmer groups or grower groups from across Australia. Research working with industry for the purpose of undertaking R&D to give farmers the tools and knowledge they need to better manage their soil for productivity and profitability outcomes. So we've got a range of projects, range of activities across the country, most of which is detailed on our website. But and today we're going to hear a bit more about one of those projects. And this continues our webinar series, which is now well established. And we've been going for a month or two. And just in terms of our upcoming webinars, 2 weeks' time, we've got one by Dr. Arabin Surupaneni and Dr. Balaji Sasadri on impacts of liquid injection of biosolids on soils, plants and groundwater. And I'm also pleased to today announce our next 2 webinars in the series in August. First one by Professor Chen at Griffith University on evaluating alternative rhizobial carriers. What alternatives are there to peat-based carriers for delivering microbes to the soil and to the root systems? And then a webinar by Dr. Shane Powell of the University of Tasmania on developing an e-nose or an electronic nose for smelling soil. So if that sounds intriguing, make sure to look out for those webinars. The first one you can register for on our website, as you have done for this webinar. The next 2 in August, registration details will be going onto our website next week. But the details for the first one, it's also in your chat box if you're online and look at your chat box. A few on our website also, you'll also find recordings of past webinars. And similarly for this webinar today, it is being recorded and you'll be able to access the recorded webinar from next week once we get it loaded. And just continuing on our housekeeping, as I said, this webinar is being recorded. Mark will speak for 20 to 25 minutes and then we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end. The way we'll manage that is if you can type your questions into the Q&A box, which you should be able to see but on the bottom of your webinar screen. Don't type them into the chat box. You can chat in the chat box, but for the questions, we'll be going to the Q&A box and we'll work through the questions at the end. So Professor Mark Morrison is at Charles Sturt University, based at Bathurst. He's the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Business, Justice and Behavioural Sciences. So it is an example of the Soil CRC. It's not just about soil scientists. We bring a range of disciplines to bear to address soil-related R&D issues. And Mark's particular interests are in environmental economics and environmental marketing. Today, he's going to speak about opportunities for activating consumer markets for good soil stewardship, or alternatively, will consumers pay more for good soil management? With that introduction, I'll pass over to Mark and he can continue. Mark, you can share your screen.
Right, thanks, Mike. I'll just try to get my screen up. Can you see that now?
Yes, that's good now, thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for that introduction and also for giving me the opportunity to talk about this project. So we're working on several projects, not just myself, but others in the Soil CRC, related to activating various markets to encourage soil stewardship. There's a team working on finance markets. We've previously done some work on property markets, and this project is about consumer markets. And we have quite a large and capable team, not just from Charles Sturt University, but also 3 researchers from University of Tasmania as well. So background to the project. So what we're trying to do in this project is to look at the potential to activate the consumer market for rewarding primary producers for quality soil management practices. And we're looking at consumers as well as value chain stakeholders. So that includes manufacturers, retailers, farmer groups, as well as others in the value chain, think silos, stockyards, etc. To understand consumer interest in food produced using quality soil management. Do they want it? Are they willing to pay for it? Barriers and constraints of the different value chain stakeholders for rewarding farmers for soil stewardship. So even if they wanted to do it, what might make it difficult? What information they might require, the stakeholders, including do they need information on consumer willingness to pay and other information in order to reward producers. And also whether we can use effectively communication options to activate the market. So we can investigate the potential market that there is at the moment, but markets can be developed, they can be created. So can we effectively use different communication options to shift the market from where it is now so that consumers more greatly desire and seek food products that are produced using quality soil management practices? So we started early last year with a literature scoping study, and that looked at all of the markets that I mentioned previously, the finance and property markets as well. And we also looked at consumer markets there. And one of the studies that we found there was an Australian study. They talked to about 15 food manufacturers. And it was a while ago, but they found that back then, and they weren't just looking at soil, they were looking at environmental practices of farmers, and they found that the value chain was not yet ready to reward farmers for environmental standards. And there were 3 main reasons for that. First was, well, the difficulty and the expense of verifying claims across the value chain. They needed to be able to defend the claims that they were making about products produced in an environmentally friendly way, and they couldn't easily do that. They thought also there were problems with customers, that customers were simply aware of what descriptions such as green, environmentally sustainable, and eco-friendly really meant. And, and also they found that in the past, these terms had been used inappropriately, and that had created confusion amongst customers. And there was negativity towards those terms. What was interesting to us was, I mean, that study was slightly old, but that finding that it's too hard in Australia contrasted with what is happening now internationally. So in Europe, certain parts of the USA, such as California, there is a real groundswell and a real demand by consumers for environmentally friendly produce, which includes soil management. And environmental standards are being adopted internationally and really being pushed by key food manufacturers. They're requiring farmers to produce using certain standards. And so it's really happening. Whereas at least 14 years ago in Australia, it certainly wasn't. We also, in our scoping study, found that food purchasing was motivated by several things. Environment was there, but it's not high. So sensory experience, taste, etc., health, and price were the main factors. There's a series of studies that have investigated willingness to pay for agricultural production practices. They've investigated labelling and certification quite a lot as well. And farm practices and labelling can influence purchasing decisions for certain food products. A lot of evidence that happens. For example, organics and animal welfare. Yet almost no evidence yet that consumers are willing to pay for soil management practices, at least in the academic literature. So let's get now to our research in this project. So we did three things: focus groups, we've been doing value chain interviews, and we've done a desktop review. So first, our focus groups. This is our first round of focus groups with another 2 rounds planned. So we did 5 focus groups in the last quarter of 2019. 2 of them were conducted in Hobart, one for general consumers and one for vegetarians and vegans. We tried to keep the groups homogeneous, and one in Bathurst, general consumers, and so that included younger and older consumers, and then 2 in Parramatta, which is essentially the geographic centre of Sydney. And again, like Hobart, one for the vegans and vegetarians and one for general consumers. We think it would make good sense to do one further group that we believe is missing at the moment, sort of younger inner metro, sort of eastern suburbs type folks that are a little wealthier. That would be another group to investigate. And we're trying to do that at the moment, but it's a little bit tricky because of COVID and limitations of doing face-to-face research. So our preliminary analysis focused on 3 key questions. What do consumers want? Where do consumers get their information? And what do consumers know about soil? So what they want is complex. They think about multiple product attributes. And you can see the list there. I won't read them to you. But there are a range. It does include environment, health, provenance, whether it's Australian grown. And there were some things that they don't want. They don't want chemicals. Some people don't want it to be unhealthy. Plastic certainly came up. There's an anti-plastic group. We saw that people were most willing to pay for specific things. For example, organics or limited plastic, free-range eggs. Convenience was definitely there. Taste was big. Certainly healthy options featured. Where do consumers get information? Range of sources. Depends a little bit on your age. We found there were certain people that it really is just online. Tended to be younger people, but not just younger people. Older generation tended to focus a bit more on in-store material. Some people it's friends and family. For some it's TV, cooking shows, and labels as well are looked at. There was generally a lack of understanding of labels. Some things such as the heart tick people knew about. Trust in labels was really variable. A number of people cited instances where certain events had diminished their trust in a specific label. So what do consumers know about soil? Well, the reality is for most of them is not a lot, if anything. Some people who, for example, had a farming background or a connection with the land knew about soil, or maybe they had a vegetable garden, so they knew a bit about it for that reason. But really, for most people, there's just not a lot of knowledge, so there's a real need to educate people about it. Some other points of interest from the focus groups. Balancing priorities. A lot of people go in and it really is a trade-off between things like price and quality. And they don't just buy on price alone. They will actually trade off, which is good news from the perspective of you know, soil health being another feature of quality. Some people really commented that, you know, the challenge with thinking about soil health is it's just another thing to be considered, and there's so many other factors, you know, that they have to think about: animal welfare, organics, you know, pesticide. There's just many things, and you know, there was a request, you know, look, can you just bring it all together in one label? It would make life so much easier for us, just to simplify our decision process. Skepticism, I've already mentioned that. A real issue with labeling is the trustworthiness of the label. Hence, one of the things we have been investigating, and we will continue to investigate, is what's the most sort of trusted source for a label. And there was a real range of views around what was considered trustworthy. Trade-off between quality and price. I already mentioned that. And you know, some people, it's, you know, they just buy on quality, but others really do trade off. Here's another interesting finding for us, and that is that people really thought that healthy soil equals healthy food. You know, I realize the link between healthy food and healthy person is much more tenuous, but very much, you know, people did see that if, you know, if you do look after the soil, it will be more likely to produce food rich in, you know, nutrients and trace minerals and so on. So we looked at our information from the focus groups, and we used that information to create 4, if you like, segments of consumers. We actually developed prototypes, which we've named, to represent the 4 sort of groups of customers that we identified across the 5 focus groups. And they were the sustainable shopper, interested in the environment, the juggler, somebody who, you know, really traded off sort of price, quality. They were quite possibly very price conscious, but they were juggling multiple priorities, including a need often to feed a larger family. The shopper that in some ways connected to the land and provenance stories really resonate with. And then the what's in it for me shopper. They're really concerned with their health and whether it tastes good and so on. And they're really just concerned with the benefits for them and not much else. And so those 4 different types of shoppers, prototypes if you like, they differed really in 3 areas. They're concerned for the environment, they're concerned for farmers, and they're concerned for the benefits for themselves. Now, moving to the value chain interviews, we've conducted 22 interviews so far. It's ongoing. It's been quite difficult to complete the interviews, in part because of COVID, and many of the food manufacturers in particular and the retailers are just flat out. And so that has made this task for us harder. But we've been pretty pleased with the number of interviews we've been able to collect. We're nearing theoretical saturation, but there are a few areas that we would like to conduct further interviews. But you know, we're doing pretty well so far. So what have we found in all of this? So we've done a thematic analysis, but I'd like to just give the caveat that these the thematic analysis has not been completed yet, so these are really our preliminary insights. So we've got 6 about the current state of play for the market, the issue of who starts the orchestra, pardon me, what are the benefits for farmers and the value chain from rewarding farmers for soil stewardship, what are the barriers, What are the facilitators? And what about the consumers? So the current state of play, there are definitely a small number of organisations that are thinking about soil health. These are manufacturers, and these are working directly with farmers, looking for suppliers, and are prepared to pay a premium for products. It is happening, but it's not widespread. Soil health is not yet on the agenda for most organisations, though water and carbon, given climate change, are on the agenda for some organisations. Retailers and manufacturers in general do not believe there is a strong indication of a market at the moment. Yes, there are some exceptions, but by and large, that's what we're seeing. But there's definite interest in the potential to activate the market, but it is considered that it would be a slow burn, sort of like where organics were 20 years ago. Not much of a market, but it's quite significant today. And that's how they think about soil stewardship. One really interesting question that has risen for us is, but who starts the orchestra? The farmer groups we spoke to indicated that, if they were provide the appropriate financial incentives and a reasonable certification process was developed, they'd be interested in supplying products with these features. The manufacturers and retailers often describe their corporate responsibility, them being change agents, and at times being market leaders, and the need to bring customers on a journey. But paradoxically, to us, they insisted that change should be market driven. There needs to be a clear market signal from consumers. They also commented that it wasn't their role to tell farmers what to do. But they also, some of them talked about how they were helping to educate farmers through agronomy services, etc. It was apparent to us that overall many stakeholders in the value chain felt that it wasn't their responsibility to lead the change, though they were interested. So it was puzzling then, given that everyone was interested, but nobody was felt responsible, who would start the orchestra on this? And I think that left us with the view that there is a real need for clear market signals from both consumers that they're willing to pay and farming industry groups that they're interested in this, so that the value chain can get activated. So what are the benefits beyond premium pricing? We went into this thinking that, look, the benefits are mostly going to be for, if consumers are willing to pay, then food manufacturers can charge more and retailers can charge more, and that allowed higher payments to farmers. There are benefits beyond that. For farmers and producers, this could include being made a dedicated supplier or having products spotlighted in stores. For manufacturers, this really stood out for last year, where supply was really challenging to achieve. A more resilient and reliable supply chain, which results in, for example, reduced costs in drought and reduced costs in simply finding suppliers. For manufacturers and retailers, benefits in being able to tell the farmer's story as a point of difference, and that can help increase market share. And that market share really stood out as, even if you can't increase price, you might be able to get a larger share of the market if you have these features. Some barriers. Physical systems, for example, siloing products separately that are grains that have been produced using good soil stewardship practices, or meat. We haven't actually spoken to a silo yet, but certainly our conversations with abattoirs has led us to believe that, look, this already happens. There's grain-fed beef, for example. They're very much practiced at separately supplying meat products with different features. And I think another challenge, another barrier is commodity cycles. When you make claims, you've got to be able to support them. And so if you have supply challenges out of season, can you guarantee supply out of season? A facilitator in the process is a simplified supply chain, and that can be really beneficial for both farmers and manufacturers and sellers. So for growers, they can have the benefit of being a dedicated supplier, and they don't have to sell into a commodity market. They have guaranteed purchases. Retailers, manufacturers can then start using the farmer story and help build the brand in that way, as well as, you know, describe provenance more generally and create greater confidence in their product. What about consumers? The value chain did see there was a segment that would pay for soil stewardship, but they did feel most customers would not pay a premium. And while not all segments will pay for soil stewardship, they did recognise that it may affect market share. So still could be worthwhile for manufacturers to incentivise. They also thought that many consumers simply don't want the details. They don't necessarily want the story about soil stewardship, but they want to just, they trust the brand. And I think these companies want to continue to build the brand and build confidence in their brand, that they look generally sustainable suppliers. Lastly, we did a desktop review, and we've sort of continued this right through the project. And what we've found is that soil is either absent or hidden on most Australian manufacturing and retail websites. But if you go and look at their secondary website and really drill in, you can find some information about soil. But on the retail websites, it's generally not there. There is growing interest in soil in the media and online. We're seeing a lot of that. I'm not going to read the list there, and we've actually got a much longer list than that in our desktop review, but increasingly there is a growing awareness in the community about soil health, soil stewardship. So what are we up to at the moment? Our current main task at present is developing the communication materials for activating the market. We've subcontracted a company, a creative agency, professional creative agency called Penzance. And we are working with them to develop communications materials for testing 6 different communication treatments or frames that are designed to activate the 4 different consumer segments. And so what we want to do is see whether these frames, which of them are most effective, perhaps at activating all of the segments or certain of the segments. And the first one is it's sort of, you might have heard of Red Tractor in the UK. It's a labelling system where it's not just about soil health. Soil health is there, but it's also about other aspects of environment, biodiversity, animal welfare, etc. So it's sort of picking up on the idea of supporting or addressing all sort of farm practices at once. A treatment looking at explaining what soil stewardship is, so it's more educative. And a treatment that emphasises provenance and the farming community. Benefits for consumers, health and taste, benefits for the environment, and one that's more about carbon storage and more generally supporting farming practices. So we're working up treatments that are video content, like a TV commercial, but can be used online in social media, websites, in-store promotions, half a dozen, I think it's 5 prototype products, a range of products, and we're looking at working with some brand champions as well. So next, as I mentioned, we're finalising the development of the communication materials. The analysis and interviewing of value chain stakeholders is continuing. A few more to go. Once we've collected the communications materials, we then have another round of focus groups and interviews with the same value chain stakeholders that we spoke to previously to see what they think of the communication materials. Depending how we go with stage 3, we may need to revise some of the communication materials and then do some subsequent focus groups and interviews. So our last slide here, thinking ahead. So this is thinking beyond the project. What do we really think needs to be done next, given that the project will wind up next year? We have, in this project, we've focused on the current project, we've focused on qualitative analysis. Ideally, we would have quantitative measures of consumer willingness to pay. It's obvious to us that the value chain really needs to have an understanding of who's willing to pay and which segments are willing to pay and how much they're willing to pay. It'd be useful to understand whether certain certification schemes and sources might be effective at stimulating willingness to pay, and also which of the communication treatments that we've developed might also shift either market share or willingness to pay. We'd like to do some real-world trials, doing some in-store marketing to see whether soil stewardship will shift consumer purchasing behaviour. We think generally there needs to be more work on certification and labelling. It's a real issue for farmer groups, so there are many different kinds of labels, certification I should say. So we need to understand what would work for landholders, farmers, but also what resonates with consumers as well. We also think that it would be worthwhile to consider not just the Australian market, but export markets as well. So that's where we think this line of inquiry could go in the future. So now we're at questions and answers. And if we don't get to your question today, please feel free to email me at that email address.
Thank you very much, Mark. So I think the research that you presented very much shows the value of asking the customer what is it that they want and not making assumptions. So we have a few questions there in the Q&A box, and I'll read them out and Mark can answer them. And just a hint to everybody else, if there's a question there that was the same question you were going to ask, you can upvote it, give it a thumbs up, and it'll jump to the top of the list. As what's happened with Nancy's question. So Nancy Boland, one of the questions for what consumers want is Australian grown. My question is, do consumers want Australian grown because they want to support our farmers, the buy Australian national pride type argument, or because they believe Australian grown is clean and healthy products come from healthy soil? I'm asking this question because, for example, Australian grown barley is in huge demand in India simply because consumers believe that their product is clean and healthy. Mark.
Yeah, Nancy, I think that it's a good question. And I think that both motivations are there. I think people did like in the focus groups the sort of the provenance story and the story of the Australian family and supporting it, and if we want to have Australian products going into the future, we have to stand by our farmers and support them. So that sort of pride in Australia story was there, but there were others that were moved more by the provenance and knowing where something came from and that it is healthy. And I suppose it's partly related to the health, valuing the healthiness of soil. So I'd say both, Nancy.
Thank you, Mark. Question from David. What criteria would you consider to be potentially assessed to define a healthy soil, i.e. microbiome population present or density, toxicity levels?
So partly, look, consumers can't get into that level of detail. So as we said at the beginning, their understanding is far more sort of simplified than that. We partly described soil stewardship in our focus groups in terms of a range of practices and other features. I can't remember them all now, but, sort of permeability, carbon content, a few other aspects, but you can't get into a great lot of detail. I can certainly share how we did describe them in the focus groups if folks are interested. But one of our challenges in the communications is to educate people about that and just give them the basics that they need to know, but not a lot.
And dare I say, Mark, that question's not entirely for a environmental economist or marketer to answer. It's also one that we're looking at in other programs of the Soil CRC, especially Program 2, Soil Performance Metrics, about what to measure and what it means in defining a healthy soil.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we sought advice from the Soil CRC on how to answer this question because we are not the experts. We are not the scientists. And if there are critical aspects of soil that, need to be used to define it, now's a really good time if anybody's got any other ideas to tell us as we're developing the comms materials. But
okay. So Mark, Mark, a question for Mark Frost. Are there linkages between how consumers view soil stewardship and how financial markets view them? Unless there's a premium in the product price, will markets be reluctant to reward farmers in property values, loan ratios, etc.?
To an extent, there is going to be a link. I mean, if consumers are willing to pay more, it's going to obviously improve the returns to farmers, and so that reduces risks in terms of lending. I would say there is a link, but irrespective of whether there's a link, there's still a pretty strong case for financial markets to reward landholders because it just shifts the risk profile in my view for landholders.
Thank you.
As well as preserving land value.
A question from Ines Venenzi. Did you find consumers to have some knowledge about what organic versus non-organic means, as well knowing the environmental impacts of consuming seasonal products and locally grown products?
I don't think I quite understand the second question. Maybe you could rephrase that one for me. But the first one, there's some understanding of organic versus non-organic. I think people associated organic with a lack of use of pesticides, but I would say there was confusion between organic and soil stewardship. Sometimes organic was seen as meaning soil stewardship, so there is a challenge there to address.
I think on the second one, Mark, sometimes a feature is to buy produce that's in season as opposed to out of season, and out of season implying it's been grown in glass houses or been imported from the Northern Hemisphere or from somewhere else. Similarly with locally grown versus something that's travelled many miles to get here.
Oh, okay. So food miles and so on. Look, I think the question of food miles certainly did come up, but it wasn't a top of mind issue for many people. Certainly, I mean, there were certain people that were, particularly in Hobart, sort of the more vegan, vegetarian type folks were very much concerned about food miles, but even more than food miles was their attitudes towards plastic. That was really big. They really hated plastic.
Okay. So a question here from Louise Edmonds. Where does the finance sector sit in this story? Could there be incentives from financiers to farmers for soil stewardship, being TCFD?
Absolutely. Yes. And that's why there is a separate project being led by Nick Pawsey from CSU. Involves a few others, I think, from USQ as well, and Fed Uni. That's really focusing on this. There's a lot of interest in the banking sector as well. So absolutely, it's a real opportunity. Certainly my view of all of this is that, there's potential for several different markets to create a really good signal for landholders to do this and to facilitate landholders to doing this, because it does cost money.
So Louise and others interested in that space, look out for the future webinar by Nick Pawsey, who will update you on what's happening with the financial sector.
So the second question there was actually about the fiduciary duty of the manufacturers. It's that's interesting. Certainly the manufacturers often have sort of codes that they expect producers to supply against. So there are some requirements that they typically have, but it is a bit of a negotiation, I think, with industry as well. So they would probably argue that they do have codes and they are supplying appropriately against that. I guess the real challenge is at what level do you set that?
Thanks, Mark. Question from Peter Morrison. Is not soil stewardship just a subcomponent of best practice generally on farm? Therefore, would it be more achievable to aim for best management practice type accreditation, of which soil stewardship is one component?
Yes, look, it is a subcomponent. I would agree with that. Look, I guess that's what we're looking at. I mean, that's the the red tractor sort of argument. Is that something that will really appeal to consumers? Can we get that going? I think at the moment it's not something really that our goal here is to activate the market for soil stewardship, and at the moment it's just not something that for most consumers they're aware of or looking at. And so I guess our goal here in this project is to drive a certain type of behaviour change, recognising that soil is really important. So I guess the risk of just aiming for best management practice is that our goal of really facilitating a change in this key area would be lost.
Thanks, Mark. And just on the previous one about our financial sector project with Nick Pawsey, I was reminded, Louise and others, that actually Nick did do a webinar back in May, a shorter 10-15 minute webinar, which is available on our website under us. One for you from Robbie, a few compliments there. Have you considered discussing this research and some possible next steps with integrated food manufacturers such as Sunrise, as this vertical operation reaches growers, manufacturing, retailers and consumers in a captured environment? Sunrise, for instance, can own and control its messaging. So are you looking at working with integrated food industries like this?
Yes. Look, Robbie, we've been trying to talk to as many food manufacturers as we can. We're somewhat limited by their willingness to talk to us. So that has affected us. We have certainly talked to some manufacturers that really control much of the supply chain, not necessarily up to the retail level, but are fairly broad. But would we like to do that? Absolutely. If we can.
Thanks. So a question from Ian Hashlacker. What's considered a price premium? 1, 5, 10, 15, 20%? What's the optimal markup for premium?
That's a quantitative question. And, I think at the next stage, we would really like to do some choice modelling or something like that. And that will answer that question. Agree, it's an important question.
Okay, thank you. One from David. What communication and collaboration does this study and the Soil CRC have with the organic industry? Seems a parallel.
Yes. So certainly in the project leading up to this one, we definitely, I can recall interviewing folks in the organic industry. I can't recall whether we've done, I have been involved in about half the interviews. I haven't been involved in all of them for this project. We have a large team, obviously. I would assume we've actually interviewed some folks from the organic industry as part of this particular project, but we'll double check that we have. If we haven't, we will rectify that as long as they're prepared to be interviewed.
Thanks, Mark. And as CEO, I might just help answer that question, given it refers to the Soil CRC. Listen, the same question could be posed and substitute with, say, regenerative agriculture movement as well. And my perspective there is that from a Soil CRC perspective, we're farming systems agnostic. We're focusing on how we can manage the soil to improve it. That might be relevant to organic farmers. It might be relevant to regenerative farmers. It might be relevant to a whole range of farming practices and sectors. Question from Simon Winfield. If Australian consumers are behind California and Europe in their knowledge of environmental standards, what can we learn from large environmentally leading groups such as Kering? How are Kering educating their consumers?
Yeah, look, good question. Particularly in the US, there are some really good groups that are working to educate consumers about soil particularly. There's one that's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember what it is. If anyone's curious, you can email me and I'll tell you who it is. But they develop really, really good information that they have available on the web, and lots of it that can educate consumers. I think there really is a groundswell. I mean, we're starting to see it in a sense in Australia with a lot of sort of articles that are coming out here and there on, for example, regenerative soil agriculture, I should say. But it's it's mostly just one-off articles, a certain media release without a lot of people, providing a lot of definitions and a lot of detail, and that's problematic. I don't think it's necessarily, there's no groups really sort of owning this in Australia. There is a group of food manufacturers that is more committed to environmental sustainability. So there's real interest there as well in amongst that group. But for consumers, I think we could really have bodies that are educating consumers. I'd say also with farmers as well, there's probably opportunity to educate around landholders as well. In our earlier work on hedonics, we found there was really a lot of people didn't necessarily look at soil as much as they might when they were purchasing, for example. So I think there's opportunity for education in a couple of different areas.
Okay, listen, we just ticked over 11:45. What I'll ask is that no one asks any more questions, and we'll deal with the remaining couple that are here on the Q&A chat. If you do have further questions, email them to Mark directly at CSU. So Mark, from James Trodel, have you spoken to experts from the quality management industry? Consumers will only respond to a simplified generic model. This is a QM, quality management issue. And then the second part, how does the red tractor system work? Have you for adopting red tractor?
Look, we have spoken to people that are into sort of environmental farm auditing. They've reached out to us really, which has been terrific. And so we have, and our work, and also the work of in the finance area and even the property area, less so, but still there. This whole sort of question of quality management, certification, etc. It's a problem that has to be solved together to really facilitate the activation of these markets. So it's work that needs to be done. Consumers will only respond to a simplified generic model. Quite possibly, but that's why we're doing the testing of the different treatments to see what messages and what might work well. We may well find that something like Red Tractor does work very well. Obviously, it's got the British flag in the middle of it. We probably wouldn't want that, but it might be that something like that does work well in the Australian context, and that's why we're doing the testing.
Thank you. And yeah, Red Tractor, I've seen a talk given on it. So in terms of how it works, it is. I encourage you to Google it and have a good look at the Red Tractor for those who don't have any familiarity with it. Probably the last question here, on a good one to finish, Mark. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high value understanding, what, in your judgment, where do consumers sit now re the connection between healthy soil and food quality?
I mean, I would probably say, well, I mean, it depends on the consumer. Like, there are certain segments who very much believe that it's very strong, and they would, say, it's 10 out of 10. It's, if you get healthy soil, you're going to get healthy food. They just very much believe it. There's probably some segments that are consumers that are 6 or 7 out of 10, and there's others that they're just not really aware of it. They're not thinking. When they go and they buy on price, and that's all. They've got a large family to feed. They're struggling on their current salary, etc., and they just buy what's cheapest. And but they might still have a belief about it. I suppose it's possible, but they just can't afford it.
Thanks, Mark. The last two there are really comments there from Richard Doyle, a soil scientist and leader of our program too, soil performance metrics at the University of Tasmania, highlighting the importance of soil carbon. Most key part of soil health as it's the food for the soil food web, activates chemistry, interacts with soil mineralogy, facilitates the soil biology, the soil plant connections, and finally helps generate the soil space. And about soil health, it's not just about healthy foods, but also it impacts upon the environmental aspects, which also affect human health. Mark, can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen as we come to an end here? And I will share my screen that just has some of our social media type connections. So to finish off, thank you, Mark, for that very engaging presentation and the update on this fascinating research. Thank you to all the attendees for your participation and the useful questions at the end. And those questions also provide feedback in a way for the research team in the Soil CRC. I'll refer you to our website, www.soilcrc.com.au, for further information about this project and others. Also encourage you to follow us on Twitter at Soil CRC, to connect with us, follow us on LinkedIn at Soil CRC, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Soil CRC. And via all those pathways, whatever suits you best, you can see this webinar and be updated on future webinars and other activities that the Soil CRC is running. So thank you all for your attendance and wish you well. Hope to see a few of you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.